Institute's presentation of different schools of thought, how schools respond to conflict. My name is Jenn Magida, and I'm the CEO of New York Peace Institute, and really pleased to be here and welcome all of you to this exciting event. New York Peace Institute has a long history of working in schools. We've worked with the DOE to provide special education mediation for a very long time. And in 2016, we started a restorative justice project in a number of schools that has continued and expanded to this day. And this is a particularly important time for us to be talking about schools. There's a lot of conflict and increasing conflict in schools. And in addition, there are a lot of safety concerns that I know we're all very worried about, especially the parents of kids in schools. So we're really happy to welcome you to have this dialogue, and we hope you will enjoy it. Our moderator for tonight's panel is our amazing director of training, Ayanna Behin, who is a parent of 2 kids in the New York City school system, as well as an incredible mediator, trainer, and facilitator. And I'm really thrilled to introduce you all to her now. So Ayanna, I'm gonna have you take it away.
Thanks so much, Jen, for that introduction. Thanks, panelists and guests. Tonight's conversation means so much to me. As Jen said, I am a parent of public school kids. I'm a graduate of New York City Public Schools. I was a elected parent leader. And in my role in New York Peace Institute, working with schools and organizations to address conflict head on, this topic is incredibly resonant for me. So I'm excited that we're here tonight. I'm excited about our incredible panelists, Lori, Jennifer, Josh, and Kailani. Hi, thank you and welcome. And I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and then tell us a little bit about how you're connected to this topic and maybe how it resonates with you. So I'm going to start with you, Lori. Hi, and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Ayanna, and thank you, Jen, the Peace Institute, for holding this panel and inviting us from Include NYC. My name is Lori Podvesker, and I lead the policy work at Include NYC. I am also a parent of an almost 20-year-old who attends a District 75 program on the Lower East Side. And up until this year was vice chair of the panel for educational policy. And, conflict and mediation has long interested me and our people in terms of due process in the world of special education and mediation. But even more so since the pandemic in the last 2.5 years, as or what feels like we are living in more polarized times, and how, communications is at the root of restorative justice and restorative practices, and what that has looked like in schools with our population in the last 2+ years. So thank you for having us.
Thanks, Lori. Jennifer, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. My name is Jennifer Agbanyo. I'm a junior in a Catholic high school in Throgs Neck. And I believe instant punishment and suspensions are not always effective, and sometimes solutions that inspire growth and push the students to reevaluate their behavior and their views are much more beneficial to them in the long run. And I think that restorative practices should be encouraged throughout the education system. And that's why I'm such an avid supporter of New York Peace Institute and the work it does in schools. So thank you again for having me.
Oh, wow. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Out of the mouths of students, right? Thank you. Glad you're here. Josh, will you introduce yourself?
Definitely. Thank you all for having me. My name is Josh Modeste. I am currently a high school science teacher in Harlem. I've been teaching this is the end of my 6th year. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York, also went to New York City Public Schools. And I'm currently a doctoral student in Columbia Teachers College in the science education program. And so why I was really interested in this topic, Kailani, my really great friend, told me about it and invited me. And so as a Black man working in a school with predominantly Black and brown students, it's really important how we interact with our students as adults and how they interact with each other. As we know, Black boys and girls are disproportionately affected by discipline in schools, which can lead to things like push out and incarceration, things like that. So I think this is a really perfect opportunity after the pandemic to kind of rethink the way that we approach discipline and conflict resolution and community engagement. And so this is why I decided to agree to join to this panel and to learn and grow from all of us here. So thank you all for having me.
Wow, thanks so much, Josh. Incredible work that you're doing, and really glad you could be here. Finally, my colleague, Kailani.
Good evening, everyone. I wasn't even thinking about my own responses, but just to kind of introduce you to me, I am Kailani Capote, working with New York Peace Institute now going on about 6 years. 4 of those years I was in a high school, supporting them from their traditional ways of dealing with discipline to a more restorative approach. And I know we've been using the word restorative, and so just to back up and just say that restorative justice and restorative practices are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are different. So restorative justice, most people are familiar with, is the response to harm. So something happens and we bring people together, we have a circle, or we have a conference about it. Where restorative practices are those things we do to prevent harm from happening. So we do things like community building circles. We use effective statements, affective with an A, statements that are expressing our emotion and how we feel about things, positive and negative. So using all of these kind of skills to prevent those things that Josh was talking about when it comes to discipline. So, we use circles for a bunch of different things, from community building to also responding to harm. And so definitely tied into conflict in a lot of different ways. We get a lot of different inquiries to facilitate different processes. So conflict is kind of what we eat and drink and breathe. So that's why I'm here, and that's why this topic is so important to me.
Thanks so much, Kailani. And thanks for giving us kind of just like a basic understanding of what we're talking about here, because I know different people have different understandings of those words, restorative process and restorative justice. And it's going to be great for us to be grounded in that here, that same definition. So what I want to add is that, what everybody has said here really resonates with me. I'm sure it does with a lot of the other people in the audience. And in my role in New York Peace Institute, I want to add that what I have seen in schools is that they're kind of a microcosm for the rest of the country, right? This is where people come together regardless of class and educational background and race and gender, and they're all put together in a tight space, with a profound mission to learn and grow and teach children and help them grow. And so this is where a lot of our community conflicts kind of take place, right? They're kind of the canary in the coal mine, the view into our future for the country and the conflicts that we face. So I also thought it was really important to have this conversation, and I love having you all here with your various expertise and your just ability to really share information so well. So I just want to dig right in with the first question, which is, kind of about what you just said a little bit, Kailani, about how things have changed as a result of COVID. And I want to ask you all, how do you feel like conflict has changed, or the way that conflict is handled has changed in your schools and communities as a result of the pandemic or social justice movements like Black Lives Matter over the past couple of years? And if it's okay with you, I want to start with you, Jennifer, since you're in the schools.
So something that I've noticed in my school environment post-pandemic is the administration has become more aware of the effect of recent events on students. So they have emphasized the practice of patience on students, especially from teachers. Teachers are more lenient towards assignments, when you should submit it, things like that. And that has also extended to how conflicts are handled. So the assistant principal of student life is in charge of handling conflicts, and he has transitioned to more of a mediating approach. He is serving as a mediator. So he sets up a conversation between the students. The person who caused the harm faces the person who was harmed, and they have an open dialogue. They talk about their feelings and they try to understand where each person is coming from. And I think that that's really important. And that's how it's changed from previous years. Previous years have been more of just instant action. That dialogue has been skipped. So I think the pandemic was really important in changing that, and it's made a big difference.
Thanks, Jennifer. So it sounds like things have kind of slowed down and they're taking a different approach to kind of look at the students and see what's really going on for them. Really appreciate that. Thank you. How about you, Josh? What kind of changes have you seen kind of in your role as a teacher?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about also my experience as a student in New York City schools. I think when I was younger, like punitive action was kind of the way to go, like suspensions, things like that. And so I became a teacher at a really interesting time when I think restorative practices and restorative justice started to take off. So before I started my job, I actually had a circle training. So that was one of my first interactions with figuring out like, how am I going to approach conflict in my classroom? And I think because like there are not very many Black male teachers, there's certain expectations held of us. Like we need to be aggressive. We need to walk around with a bat like Joe Clark, things like that, to use our intimidation factor to build relationship. But through the circle training and working with students through advisory program in my school, I was able to use relationships to leverage behavior, conflict, things like that. So my school, when I first started, we had a restorative justice coordinator, Kailani, who was really influential in kind of building that structure in our school, specifically through the advisory program. So my school has an advisory program where teachers are assigned to a group of about 10 or 12 students, where we talk weekly about things dealing with social emotional learning, how to deal with conflict, different society issues going on in society. And during the pandemic was really a challenge because that physical space that we had to have circle, to have open discussion, it kind of changed. And a lot of kids in my classes like weren't comfortable putting cameras on, which kind of created a barrier for certain areas of vulnerability that were present in person. And so that was kind of a barrier. I think there were certain ways like students were more vulnerable in certain ways because there was a lot more access to information about mental health and all of the kind of like issues in society around police brutality and things like that. Coming back from COVID, I think was definitely a challenge. I think the resocialization for both adults and students, there was this push to get back to normal, and we weren't asking people what they needed or what should look different. And so there was a lot of conflict in the beginning of the year because people were having personalities that didn't necessarily mesh or belief systems that didn't necessarily mesh. And so it took some work to kind of build back into that, being able to talk it out and developing the vocabulary, particularly for like our freshmen and our 10th graders who did not have any high school, like in-person high school experience. So advisory was really the place where we were able to process like, how are you feeling right now? What is causing you to feel like this? What are the words that describe how you're feeling, and what are some steps we can take to help reduce your stress, anxiety, your issues? And so I think having that foundation was definitely a benefit to coming back from COVID, but there were absolutely challenges in just the readjustment back to like the regular school day.
Yeah, I hear you. I was thinking that too, just listening to your answer, that having that foundation in restorative practices meant that you as a staff were able to like support each other in a different way and ask the questions that the kids needed, like, what do you need? And ask questions of your colleagues instead of just assuming what the answer is or forgetting that this has been a trauma that these kids have gone through. So thanks so much for that, Josh. Lori, I want to ask you the similar question, but a little differently, you know, just because of what you do with Include NYC and just how you feel like, or how you've seen traditional discipline kind of change, you know, when it comes to dealing with students with disabilities.
Yeah, so I think, you know, this question could be applied to so many different scenarios, even within the subpopulation that I'm representing. in which, just to give context, there's almost 300,000 students in New York City who receive special education services. And that size alone would make our population the 6th or 7th largest school district in the country, if not the world. And we forget that, we're about 21% of the overall student population here in the city in public schools. And so, like Josh was saying and Jennifer was saying, I do think the system has become, and the people obviously behind it, have become more compassionate because we all collectively have experienced trauma. And in some ways it's leveled the playing field in terms of commonality among feelings. And so, it's actually pretty wild. I'm sitting here thinking about, what things are like now. And prior to the pandemic, the city had just started to implement new policies and procedures around discipline and restorative justice and practices to reduce suspensions and the disproportionality among students of color. And so I do think it's going to be hard for us to gauge what those outcomes are at this particular time, because students were not in school easily for a year, and that the majority of students with IEPs in all settings, including District 75 and private placements that the city pays for, about 85% identify of color. And in more restrictive settings and segregated settings, kids who attend District 75 programs, it's about 92% of 26,000 kids are of color. From a policy and procedural point of view, I do think things are continuing to be more human-centered and less punitive and more about targeted behaviors. It's more about the do's than the don'ts, thank goodness. But culturally, I think we have not moved far enough. And so much of this is about democracy and values and the intersection. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the word intersectionality. It upsets me. And this is just my own view. This isn't Include's view. And in full disclosure and full honesty, the reason why is because when we don't take apart the disability needs, the assumption is made that they are met through students being of color, and they are separate, even though they are same. And I'm talking from a pedagogical perspective, and also from a sense of belonging, right? And so much tension is the result of shared spaces and people not having an understanding of disabilities in general. And historically, students with disabilities being educated in separate settings and people not interacting with each other, and therefore being fearful.
Right.
If the majority of kids with disabilities, well, let me put it this way. There's about 60,000 kids with IEPs who spend the majority of their school days in segregated settings and not integrated with gen ed students. Right. That says a lot. I can go on, I'll stop.
I mean, it sounds like you really can, Lori, because it's so layered, right? There's the out of sight, out of mind piece. There's the politics piece. Like, is there still a will for this kind of human-centered change in education? Like, are we still going to keep moving in that direction, or not, because the politics have changed around that, or even because we have 2 years of no data? People going to still give it a chance? And then, do you get the supports that you need for this kind of systemic change? And are children with disabilities left behind, as you say, because people look at them and say, well, we're giving money towards kids of color, so this counts, right? And so where's that nuance I really appreciate that, Lori. Thank you. Thank you for that. So Kailani, I don't know if this is going to be building on what Lori said around schools, or if you want to think about it, you know, holistically in terms of the work that you're doing in the restorative justice department. Kind of what do you feel has changed? What kind of changes you see as a result of the pandemic and social justice movements?
Yeah, definitely. So I want to start with like a mini story where I had a conversation with a dean of a school at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were having remote detention. And so kids would have to log on to Zoom and be in detention with the dean and complete whatever assignment they needed to complete in detention. I found that to be mind-boggling. Like, so even at the height of the pandemic where people are so unsure about what's going on, we're still finding time for detention. It felt wrong, right? It felt wrong because we tried to do business as usual and it was not business as usual. So that goes for all of us, right? It was that this transition to just being on Zoom. Oh, we're just home, but we're still doing the same thing. No, not when there's a cat and your dog and your kids, right? Like it's not business as usual, and we need to address that. And, you know, talking about the students and people that were so negatively affected, we assumed that everyone had multiple computers and devices at home. We assumed that people had Wi-Fi, and there were so many other things that people were needing. They needed to get food, they needed to get their medication, and et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I felt like at the beginning we were a little bit just kind of like, this will pass, this is fine, this will be 2 to 3 weeks and we'll be back. And so people just tried to use the same methods that we were using in person, and it didn't work. And so where we came in, we saw the need for people to just have space to talk. So we had circles with teachers about the pandemic and how they were coping with the pandemic. We had circles with parents from Include NYC. So parents who had children that had disabilities, they wanted a space to just like, this is insane, or my student is not receiving the services that they need. You know, all the other issues that came along with the pandemic. So we had those circles. We did other kinds of circles. So I think that over time, people became more aware of restorative practices, and like that idea of like doing the same thing over and over is not working. So let's try this other thing. So, you know, we started doing other circles, schools that have reached out to us, co-located schools, right? So multiple schools in one building having conflict about shared spaces, now coming back. You know, this school's strict on masks, this school is not strict on masks. So all these different issues that came up that weren't there prior to. We also did circles for Asian identified New Yorkers who wanted a space to talk about the violence towards the Asian community at the height of the pandemic. And so that's an example that we give to schools as well. Like, this is a circle that you can do, right? Like, you can talk about race. Like, people want to stay away from that, but it's how you do it, and in a supportive way, and those who feel comfortable to do so. But let's talk about it. Let's do it, right? So we're doing a lot of work with schools and in other communities. A school reached out to us where there was like a really big fight that happened on school grounds, and it ended up, you know, going over into where they lived as well, where the students lived. And so they reached out to us like, can we do a restorative conference? You know, principals that are making decisions without having this kind of fair process, using their staff and students and parents reaching out to us. So I think people are more aware that there are like other ways to do what they used to do. So that has definitely changed, but I definitely agree that there's just so much more to do. There's so much more left to do, right? A lot of where I was in a school, once the pandemic hit, it was like, we don't need any of that other stuff. We're just focusing on academics, where that was the stuff that people needed. They needed that social emotional support. So, you know, just remembering that, like, that is key, right? Coming back into person, people needing to have a space to talk. I hear from so many teachers what Josh was saying about just being in person and the socialization of it. Students not being used to being like full face on camera, right? They're hiding, their cameras are off, they're hiding behind their phones. These different things that are coming up. So I think we've come a long way. We still have a ways to go. Absolutely.
Thanks for that, Kailani. And, you know, it's just making me think again about how schools are kind of at the forefront of so many different kinds of conflict. You know, colleagues, I mean, people, I feel like you all have talked a lot about the children and the adults, but a lot of times people forget about the adults and their needs and how they need to be supported in order to give the kids what they need. So I want to just switch gears just a little bit and ask this question about accessibility to restorative practices. Like, you know, how can we change our approach so that communities where restorative practices haven't been traditionally used are, you know, how do we make this work more accessible to people who don't now have access to it? And I want to start with you, Lori, you know, to talk a little bit about the community that you represent, and then maybe Kailani, you have some other ideas.
Yeah, thanks. So like I was saying earlier, there's like subpopulations within the subpopulation. And, you know, the majority of students with disabilities are classified with speech and language impairment or learning disabilities. It's about 75% of all kids with IEPs. And then it's about 11% of the kids school age, ages 5 through 21, are classified with autism, other health impairment, which includes ADHD, and about 4% with emotional disturbance, and about 3% with intellectual disabilities. And within each subgroup, you know, every kid is different, but similar characteristics. And as a result, you know, the way that things are presented to each subpopulation has to be tailored to that group and how they access information. And so I think about my son in a District 75 program and what restorative justice looks like, and I just start cracking up. And, you know, there is the accessibility issue for each individual and then collectively. And I think a lot of it is really basic and very disability centered. And so starting with students, I think, you know, we have to see them. And like I was saying earlier, it appears that many students with disabilities are not visible. And, you know, that includes, and we all know, I shouldn't say it like that, but there is, you know, it's interrelated, right? Like Ralph Emerson's book, The Invisible Son, there is a correlation between all of that. And if you're Black or brown and disabled, you're even less visible. And so, you know, I think about kids with intellectual disabilities or kids who are on the autism spectrum. And again, this isn't all kids. And what it's like for them to identify feelings and socially, and what it's like for them to communicate, and it's challenging. So I think we need to recognize that, and we need to give them the tools to do that. My guy's almost 20, and we're using emojis to teach him feelings. And, you know, in order for him to participate in a peer discussion about conflict, he needs to know how he feels. And what we've been doing is using a picture of a thermometer that he can touch to show where it's hot, the extent, which correlates with his feelings, and then labeling them, and then, you know, practicing what to do with those feelings, but it's all interrelated. So that's just one area. But I think first and foremost, what we need to do is talk about disabilities, say the word disabilities. People with disabilities are a protected class like other minorities. And when we don't say it, we're not seeing and hearing it. And it's really important that we do. And I think, you know, there are many other examples that is what I call low-hanging fruit that don't cost money, that could have huge cultural implications. Another thing we could do is we'd have to blow up the whole system, how it's used, but maybe it's time to get rid of District 75 and integrate those kids, you know, into community schools. And so what does that look like? There is so much basic professional development that needs to happen with school staff, and we need disabilities to be part of critical race theory.
Yeah.
We need it to be part of culturally sustaining responsive education model. We need our kids to know about a history. You know, one of the silver linings of the last 2+ years and the Black Lives Matter movement is, where do people with disabilities fit within that hierarchy? Because historically, we have not included people with disabilities in the diversity conversation.
Right.
And, you know, I love that we're all have this hyper sense of awareness through the diversity and inclusion work that we're doing. We need belonging, and we also need to talk about how belonging and inclusion are not the same things.
Yeah.
We don't.
No.
How equity and equality are not the same things. And
Yeah.
we really, you know, from our perspective at Include, it's about equity more than equality. It's not about sameness, it's about fairness for everybody.
I really appreciate that. And, you know, the seeing the difference, the seeing the disability, the naming it, and not having it be an afterthought, you know, including it in the conversation as systems are being built and as changes is being made. Thanks so much, Lori. Kailani, you know, what are you thinking about the way that this work can become more accessible to people?
Well, I'm always going to say awareness, right? Because some people just don't even know restorative justice. It's the first time they're ever hearing it. So that's definitely one way. The other is restorative practices, like being a restorative practitioner or believer. It's a mind change, right? Like, we have to change the way that we're thinking of things. And so, you know, working in schools, working with teachers, I've heard things say like, well, these students need hard discipline, or that will never work with my students. You know, we trained a school in District 75, and we train them how we train them, because disabilities is not our expertise, but we gave them our training. And then, you know, just like you would do with the lesson plan, how would you modify this? Right? Because we know that maybe not everyone can sit in a circle for an hour and talk about feelings and hear other people's feelings. So how would you modify this? How can we break up the circle to do something fun, an activity, draw, you know, write something, things like that. So I definitely think we have to be mindful of how we're modifying these things, how we're talking about our students, because if you say that will never work here, then it's never going to work. You know, if you already say that, if you're coming in with that mindset, it's not going to work. So, you know, all the things that everyone has been talking about with inequities is something that we drive home all the time in our training. You know, we give examples of, like, in a circle, asking a question like, you know, when was the first time you remember walking on a beach? Is not the best question, because not everyone has been to the beach, not everyone can walk, right? So we give these examples where people are like, oh, you know, it's like this aha moment, or a question of a time you remember, or where's your favorite country to visit on vacation? Not everyone has gone on vacation. Not everyone has left the city or their borough, right? So just being mindful of how we're talking to and about students and the assumptions that we make. So, I mean, you know, we're the type of organization that we offer these kind of trainings and services on a sliding scale. So whoever comes to us, we're gonna find a way to work with you, and work with you in a way that's not breaking the bank on your end either, because let's be honest, like that's a boundary for a lot of people. They're like, oh, I see your trainings are this much, I can't do it. You know, we want to work with you. How do we get there? And really just like highlighting that restorative justice is not soft discipline. So many people feel like it's the soft way to go. You know, like I said before, these kids need hard discipline, things like that. Restorative practices are really just about having conversations. Like, how do you resolve a conflict without talking about the conflict? And so that's what it is. That's what we're doing here. And so if we're then going to refer someone out, you know, whatever happens in the conference and the conversation, if they need other support, then they're still going to get that other support, right? If there's still some type of consequence of, okay, maybe you're suspended for 5 days instead of 30, right? But there's still that conversation that happens, Because I think, Josh, you can talk about like how when a student is removed from your class, if there's no conversation and that student disrespected you and is back in your class the next day, you're still human and you're still gonna feel a way that this student is back in your class. And so many times teachers feel like nothing happened. You know, they were taken out of my class and they don't know what happened after. So they need to be included in that conversation. So I definitely think just awareness and clarifying the misconceptions around restorative justice is definitely something that we're trying to do and that we continue to do.
Thanks, Kailani. Josh, I want to call on you to enter this conversation if you want to, you know, about making these changes here in the
Definitely.
schools.
Yeah, a lot of things stuck out to me as Lori and Kai were sharing, particularly around like the invisibility of a lot of disabilities. Particularly during COVID, like with cameras off, we didn't notice a lot of them. For example, one student that I have this year, like one of my really high achieving students, and so last year he was able to get through because he was able to type up a lot of his assignments. And this year coming in, we realized that his handwriting is difficult to read, right? And so it brought up a lot of conflict with certain teachers, like, oh yeah, you just write neater, blah, 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 blah. Come to find out the student has dysgraphia, right? So the ableism was coming out unaware to anyone because we're setting expectations to a Regents exam that also causes extra conflict for students. For a lot of my students, this is like the first year they're back into school taking Regents exams. And so yesterday was like very stressful and there were a lot of conversations that I needed to have on the side or before they went in to give them a little bit of a pep talk, but nobody has sat down with them and said, all right, this is what you need to do. What is it that we need to make you feel prepared, to make you feel comfortable? And is this even what you really need? Like, do you need to take a Regents right now? Along with Kailani, like I think also the visibility of the process. I think when teachers are not invested or involved, or when staff in general is not invested and involved, they don't see the hard work that goes in behind it. And the conception is that this is easy. But when you sit in a circle or in a reentry meeting, like you realize how complex your thought process, your vocab usage has to be in order to find out what it is that the student is struggling with and what they need. And that's even harder than just writing, all right, you're suspended for 3 days, etc. And like, I think one of the issues that maybe we'll get into a little bit later, but a lot of schools in New York City are losing funding and losing resources to be able to continue this work. Like Kailani was a huge part of our school community, and coming back from COVID, we don't have her anymore. So that's been a really big challenge. This year, the budgets were just released for schools, and funding for police has increased, but funding for a lot of schools has been cut significantly. And not only like the financial resources, but the amount of trainings that are being done. Like, I don't think anybody in my school this year was circle trained, additionally from what we have had in the past. So yeah, it's a lot of like things that are now becoming aware, but we definitely need to push the bar. And I think another way to kind of create more acceptance of it is making more explicit connections to cultural practices. Like, restorative circles are a cultural practice. Like, how many times have you sat around with your grandma and she's telling you wisdom from when she was growing up, or giving you advice, talking with your brothers or sisters, things like that. Like, those are all restorative circles. They're not branded or labeled like that, but if we were to approach it like that in schools, like, this is things that our kids do every day. They're on the corner, like they're on their stoop talking to their friends about the issues that they went through throughout the day, but the teachers that they see throughout the day are not having these conversations with them, or maybe we don't give them the credit that they're able to have these conversations. Because of the way that they present themselves, or maybe the anger or the emotions that they're expressing is a difficulty, a barrier to finding out what it is that the kids actually need. So I agree with everything that Lori and Kai were saying. And I think there are some approaches that we can take. Where the challenges lie are like where people are stuck in old ways. Like, they're used to suspending people, or they're used to a dean having a certain role. They're used to Black male teachers having a certain role in the lives of Black students. So when I have a conflict with a student or something in my classroom, and I have a sit down and I talk with them, I get weird looks sometimes. It's not always rewarded for me to approach conflict that way. Like people are like, oh, why aren't you not screaming? Things like that. So I think like the visibility, having more intense conversations about disability and the different ways that it presents itself in different people, and rewarding like this behavior in people that you don't necessarily expect it from. I think would be all starts to get this conversation happening more often in schools and in other places, in prisons and jails, housing shelters, things like that, to definitely make this more normalized.
Yeah, really appreciate that. Thanks for that answer, Josh. And just the breadth and depth of it, was really helpful because, yeah, there are all of these different communities where people don't think you deserve, this process, right? It has become something that is maybe for the privileged few, and truly, so many people benefit from like having real conversations. I mean, we're humans, that's what we need, right? Thanks so much, Josh. Jennifer, I just want to ask you if you wanted to add anything before we move on to the next question.
I did want to add something. To add on to what you mentioned about teachers maybe not changing with the pandemic, I think that over time, students have kind of felt alone, especially with the Regents, especially yesterday. It's a new experience. Most people have never taken the Regents. I was lucky enough to have taken 2 before the pandemic. But unlike other peers that are in the same grade as me, they've just never taken it. So there were a lot of panic attacks, a lot of stress, and it was just never talked about. So I think those conversations really need to happen, and we need to be more open about that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, my kids both took their first Regents this week as well. And it was hard to kind of explain to them what they were getting into, right? It wasn't normalized and it wasn't part of their normal course of schooling. Okay, we have like 15 minutes, 16 minutes left. So I'm really hoping we can do kind of a lightning round. Can you share some ideas or solutions, some stories about, where conflict has been addressed in schools? And I don't know, we'll do this popcorn. Does anybody want to jump in on that one? All right, Lori, then Josh.
Yeah, so 2 examples that first come to mind is a lot of schools, as we know, a lot of school buildings have co-located programs, and every school building should have a building council in which the administration and staff members from each school get together. And, that is definitely one mechanism that buildings can use for circles, or just to plan around doing things together. And that includes non-academic activities, which goes a really long way. And especially for kids with disabilities. I mean, all kids, that's the whole thing, right? And, something else that immediately comes to mind is, and this is really hard, but for schools to adopt expectations school-wide on behavior, and also, a system, a token economy system. And, there is I guess it's a methodology. You guys would know better, like positive behavior intervention supports, PBIS. There is an office within District 75 that facilitates that, that I believe can be used by all schools, but I shouldn't say but, and it needs to be better promoted. And I think even in classrooms, if people can have conversations about what they expect from each other behaviorally and socially, that creates space to exchange ideas and for people to talk about their boundaries. And I think that's really important.
100%, Lori. Transparency, transparency, transparency. Like, I feel like that's a foundation of, solving so much conflict in spaces, and being intentional about it, Thanks for that. Josh, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, so Lori, one of mine is exactly yours, like collaboratively develop norms. And these can be on small scale within the classroom, within small groups, or even school-wide. So my school has done different varieties. We've done like advisory norms. We've even done like a 100% respect campaign where we had representatives from each grade come up with like expectations for behavior and respect, from student to staff, and even between staff members. And like, because it was student generated and collaboratively generated, there was way much more like integration and buy-in because of it. And I think always like giving the students the tools to be able to use these, like peer mediation or providing them with opportunities to lead circles, I think is a great way to kind of develop the next generation of leaders in already developing these strategies for conflict resolution, because they're the ones that are going to be taking control soon. So if we start to develop their skills and these frameworks of restorative justice and restorative practices, I think it'll just set them up for success in the future.
I love that, Josh. Collaboration and investment, right? Invest in our future and in these kids. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Jennifer.
To add on to that, my school also has something similar. We have something called the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Task Force, but we also have meetings in homerooms once a month, maybe sometimes. And what happens is that there is a space created for students to talk about certain issues. So a specific topic is brought up, there's a worksheet given out, there's activities, questions asked, where you come from, what you identify as, just questions that push students to learn more about themselves and also to learn more about other students. I think that creating those type of spaces in schools would be really beneficial, because I remember being visited by organizations, nonprofits like the New York Peace Institute in elementary school and middle school. And the messages that those organizations gave me still are in my mind. So I think that reaching students at a young age, reaching young people at a young age will make more of an impact than reaching them as adults. And also another solution that would be really important is, I think, in terms of solving conflicts, I think that pushing a student to learn about what they lack knowledge in. For example, a student who has a tendency to attack another student about maybe race or sexuality, like homophobic comments, things like that. A student like that would have a lot to learn from documentaries and activities that are about the activists and the work they made and the hate that they endured to reach where they are. Just educational things would also make a lot of impact.
Yeah. So the ignorance is a huge source of conflict, misunderstanding, right? And I'm also hearing you say, again, invest in students all through their schooling, not just when they're older, not just when they're in college or adults, and create space for community, where, and I heard Lori and Josh say the same. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Kai.
Yeah. Echo everyone. And I'll just add that there really needs to be a commitment all the way up the chain, right? So if a teacher is doing a circle in their classroom, the principal walking by shouldn't be like, what's happening, right? Like, they should be okay that circle is happening. They should trust that teacher. And when others come to visit over the principal, the superintendent, this should just be an expectation that circles are happening. We're talking about social emotional learning. All of these things are interconnected, right? It's not an added thing on top of PBIS and SEL. They're all interrelated, interconnected. And I mean, I've heard funding come up a bunch of times. My position got less and less. I went from being there 5 days a week to being there 2 days a week to being there like 0, right? So it was just this idea that like the school should be good now. And it's like, this doesn't happen overnight. It really does take a commitment financial commitment, right? Like there needs to be a person in that role who's supporting the school. And now a lot of schools are finding ways of having this teacher who's also the restorative justice coordinator. How? How, when you're teaching 4 and 5 and however many classes a day, do you also have time to respond to conflict when conflict is happening and organize the advisory program, etc. So, there really needs to be that commitment. And not all schools even have an advisory program, so that's something that needs to be looked at. We try to incorporate peer mediation as maybe like an extra period at the end of the day. What incentive do students have to join peer mediation? Can they get a grade and credit for it? Is there pizza? Because food always brings them, right? So there has to be this like overall commitment, like at the teacher level and all the way up the chain. So that would be my response to like solutions in schools.
Thanks, Kailani. So I'm hearing, commitment writ large, financial commitment and pedagogical commitment, and that it has to be at every single level. Otherwise, it doesn't get integrated and embedded into the community, and, it can't grow.
And I'll just add training, right? So many teachers are
Yeah.
thrown into the classroom or they're asked to do a circle and they have no training. There
Mhm.
really needs to be some type of support that all teachers are getting this type of training if they're expected to do the work.
100%. Thank you for that. We don't have that much time, but I know we have a few questions. So I'm going to ask Christine, if you don't mind kind of going through the Q&A or chat and letting us know what questions there are.
Sure. So this is a clarifying question for Lori. Lori, are those statistics you gave about 75% of students with disabilities fall under speech language impairment or specific learning disability true just for New York or nationally as well?
Great question. So I don't know percentages outside of the city, but most people with disabilities are learning disabled. And, there's different kinds of disabilities, and I'll try not to be cynical, but there's even a hierarchy. As we were speaking, one of the privileges that we don't talk about that a lot of people have are intellectual privileges. And, we inherit that because it's everywhere in our culture. I press on all of you to develop a sensibility about that because it is related to how we view other people and include them or not. Sorry to get off topic. That being said, it's about 10% of the population in the world naturally have disabilities, yet 21% of our kids are classified. So that tells you something. And again, the majority of people are learning disabled, not cognitively disabled, not mentally or psychiatrically or behaviorally, nor physically. Those are different kinds of disabilities.
Thanks, Lori. Appreciate that. Christine,
And
yeah.
next question. So I think this is generally for everybody. Why do you think some schools are so resistant to a new approach to handling conflict?
So should we do the same order as last time? Lori, Josh, Jennifer, Kai? You can pass.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm cynical. 2 reasons. One, status quo. And I think it's a lot of the work that you're hearing all of us each do and collectively do is disrupting the status quo, thank goodness. I used to teach, I get it. And, I think there are administrations that have been around a long time and do things. I mean, it's related to status quo. I spent a lot of time at a school in the South Bronx prior to the pandemic, and the administration had been in place 20 some odd years. And they did things a certain way because that's how they always did them. It didn't mean that they continued to work as is, but that was the design of the system, and the overall structure of the DOE just reinforces that. And so it takes people to think creatively, which is antithetic to government. and antithetic to a system as large as ours in terms of a practices perspective, right? How do you monitor these things with a system this size? Also, how do you assess that this is effective?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Because how do we measure outcomes? How do we do that if it isn't quantitatively? Problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Lori. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people are just used to the old way and are not willing to change, or maybe afraid of change in some instances. And I think like oftentimes in educational spaces, like there are like buzzwords or things that are going around. And so a lot of schools are hearing, oh, restorative, let me check a box. Let me put this person who has no idea what they're doing to lead this role, and it's gonna fall apart. And then we say it doesn't work. Or we pretend that we're doing it authentically and it doesn't work. But I think like if there is like intentional authenticity around the work and finding people that are really passionate about this work and changing the way that Black and brown kids are treated in schools, I think that'll definitely be a way to prove the effectiveness of restorative practices. But a lot of schools are not taking it seriously enough for it to be productive.
Oh, thanks for that, Josh. Jennifer, do you want to add anything?
Yes. So to add on to that, I think personally my school has been more open to restorative practices and restorative justice, and they have taken the advice they've gotten from previous students, previous alumni very seriously. And I think we've come a long way in terms of my school. And I think that that should be spread towards other schools. I don't see why other students should feel differently than we do. But yeah, we also funding for certain clubs, like cultural clubs at my school, is provided. So we're able to host events that are more inclusive to our students so that they don't feel left out. So that's important in other schools as well. One school shouldn't be, better off in that aspect than another.
So true. Thank you, Jennifer. Kailani.
I would just add that restorative practices take more time. So it's very quick to suspend someone and say, see you in a week. And restorative practices to prep everyone to come to the table, to find a time to meet, to take accountability, it takes time. So for some people who are just looking to just, in and out, it's very easy to just do the things that you're used to doing. And, we've worked with schools in the past who have gotten training in community building, but not how to respond to harm. So then when harm happens, they're like, we tried restorative, but it didn't. And it's like, well, you weren't trained on how to respond to harm yet. So let's come in and let's do it, right? So that's when we come in, reach out to us, call us. We are that support. But yeah, I think it definitely just takes more time and more effort to, do a restorative process.
Thanks, Kailani. It just does. Yeah, absolutely. People are afraid of change. They're afraid of the new, or they don't fully understand what they're being asked to participate in. And so learning more, being trained is really important. We're at 6:30. I don't know how that happened. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I wish we could keep going. I want to thank you all panelists. I want to thank you guests. I want to say that this it's not a fundraiser, but of course we're a nonprofit. So, if you can donate, please do. And I really hope that we continue this conversation. This has been so incredible. Thank you very much.